Formula One and Son. I'm Tom.
And I'm Oscar.
Well, Oscar, it was a pretty interesting weekend for the second race in Austria called the Styrian Grand Prix this weekend. And I guess the highlights were that if you were to review the weekend and you wanted to watch something, go watch qualifying. It was exciting, fascinating and wet. And the race, a little bit of normal service resumed with Lewis Hamilton dominating.
Yeah. The first lap of the race is very interesting. The last 10 laps were very interesting. Not much really happened in between.
Yeah, that's right. It certainly was a bookended Grand Prix weekend. But we saw some winners, we saw some losers, we saw some big losers, once again with our friends at Ferrari, which I'm sure we'll get into. But for me, the story of the weekend was Lewis Hamilton is back and dominating. And that was seen certainly in the race, where it was one of those races where he had pole position, which we'll talk about, led pretty much the whole way through pretty comfortably. You got the idea. But it was qualifying that got my attention, where he out-qualified everybody else in Q3 in a wet qualifying session by 1.2 seconds.
Yeah.
Just phenomenal.
And going back on the earlier sessions, P3 was actually cancelled.
Yeah, that's right.
Session.
It was a mixed weather weekend, wasn't it? So I think P1 and P2, were they dry? I think they were.
Yeah, they were dry, but
and then and there was talk that qualifying wouldn't run, of course, because it was going to be too wet, and that the P2 times would therefore be the qualifying times, and that was pretty exciting. It meant that people in P2, that's practice 2, of course, were really trying to put some laps in. None more so than Daniel Ricciardo, who was on a flying lap, setting purple sectors through P2, but hit the penultimate turn. And if you're familiar with the Austrian track, those last two turns are pretty exciting.
Yeah.
You swing, they're both right-handers. You swing right at very high speeds into the second to last turn and barely straighten up before then turning right again onto the main straight. It's where track limits get talked about a lot over the weekend. Mm-hmm. Daniel was on a flyer, turned right into that second to last corner, and the back end just went. And it's the biggest crash we've seen so far this season, isn't it?
Yeah, we haven't seen many crashes, though.
The car was a mess, an absolute mess. Fortunately, he was all right. He got out limping, though.
Yeah, he apparently hit his knee against the steering wheel.
Yeah, that's right, the steering column. He was fine afterwards. He said he felt fine afterwards, and certainly didn't seem to affect his performance for the rest of the weekend.
Another thing that we saw early on were the racing points were looking very quick. Yeah,
that's right. We had kind of that reconfirmation. The story, of course, of the first race in Austria was how slow Ferrari were. And as a result of that, they were going to rush to bring some upgrades to the second Austrian Grand Prix, the Styrian Grand Prix. And they did, not all of them, I think. And they brought some of those upgrades across. Didn't seem to make them a hell of a lot faster, though, did it?
No, they, if anything, looked even slower.
Yeah, and you were sharing with me an interesting stat about Ferrari engine teams. Oscar, what was that about?
None of them got points. All of the Ferrari engine teams got no points.
And that's Haas, Alfa Romeo, and Ferrari, right? Are the Ferrari engine teams? Yeah, and this all goes back to last year when they had this really trick engine. We talked about this last week, where they basically, I think, got found cheating and had to change their engine. So now they're a lot slower, particularly on the straights, but even on the corners as well. But as it transpired, qualifying was able to run wet every session. So full wets, no one ever went to inters. That's pretty unusual to see a session that's wet the whole way through, doesn't dry out. It got a bit drier in Q2, I think.
The track did start to clear, and then it started raining even heavier in Q3 again.
Yeah, because the Q3 times were slower. Q1, I'm just looking at Hamilton times, a 1:18.1. Now, for reference, poles usually, it was last weekend, it was a high 1:02. 1:02.9 or something?
Somewhere around there.
So we're talking, 15 seconds slower than that. It's a lot slower in the wet, even more. Q2 then 1:17.8. So it started to dry a little bit through Q2. Everyone kind of went faster. But then Q3, Hamilton's pole time, as I mentioned, much, much faster than anyone else, a 1:19.2. So you see that was slower than Q1 and Q2. So it kind of got wetter. But it made it really exciting. The drivers were skating on ice the whole way around, reminiscent of Hockenheim last year, the race almost.
Yeah.
People trying to get a clean lap in. And some real heroes came out of it. Hamilton being, amazing. Verstappen's always really good in the wet, but really couldn't do anything to answer Hamilton's pace.
on his last flying lap, he also spun at the end.
That's
which
right.
even he admitted wouldn't have made him faster than Hamilton's final time.
He was still a long way off Hamilton.
And he still
I think
got P2.
Hamilton's first lap in Q3 was faster than anyone's set afterwards. Sainz was the other big winner. I don't particularly remember Sainz being a wet weather specialist, do you?
No. He must have just had a more wet setup.
But he really put a great lap together, so he was third. And, McLaren just on this great roll. We'll talk about the race, but obviously Lando got that phenomenal podium after his last lap last weekend, where he just ate time out of Lewis and managed to snatch third
Ocon
after
also
penalties.
P5.
Ocon, what a legend. Yeah, good to see him really and outperform Daniel Ricciardo, who in the other Renault only occasionally seemed to be able to put together a wet weather lap. Did occasionally.
Yeah.
Didn't seem to get one in Q3 really. He ended up P9. But then the Ferraris were nowhere. We didn't talk about, but Leclerc didn't even make it through to Q3. Really disappointing. Vettel pipped him, but was only 10th.
Yeah, he only got P10 in the end.
Yeah, and then Gasly did a great job as well to pull his Alpha Tauri up into P8.
Yeah.
Lando up in P6 also did a good job for McLaren, and Albon down in P7. One of those weekends where, if I'm Christian Horner on the Red Bull team, I'm looking at Albon, and not only in qualifying, but in the race, which we'll talk to, just one of those races where he's just miles off. The Verstappen was up there with the Mercedes most of the weekend, probably driving the wheels off the car. It's not as fast as the Mercedes, but Albon's then back with the midfield.
Yeah.
What was a little bit surprising, Oscar, is that the racing points in qualifying didn't do well.
Yeah.
Perez was out in Q1.
And Stroll in P13.
Yeah. Now, they weren't good in the wet. You could argue that they set their car up maybe for a dry race. And I think, as we'll see when we talk about the race, that was probably the case because they were on fire in the race.
A couple people got grid penalties.
Who
Norris, who qualified 6th, ended up starting in P9.
What was that for?
It was
overtaking
under yellow flags.
Yep.
And Leclerc got a penalty, I think. He started in P14, I want to say.
Right, yeah, that's right. What did he do? Do you recall? Something naughty.
Something.
So a couple
he
of grid...
blocked Kvyat, I think.
That's right, yeah, there was some issue with Kvyat, wasn't there? And Grosjean didn't even qualify,
Grosjean
right?
started from... Giovinazzi got a 5-place grid penalty.
Yep.
For something.
Yep, but he was P19
and Grosjean started from the pit lane, so... Didn't
matter,
Giovinazzi, who I think changed his gearbox after crashing out in Q1, got a 5-place grid penalty for changing it, but he got demoted 0 places because he was in 19th and Grosjean started from the pit lane because he changed something in Parc Fermé.
Just as you say there that he got a penalty for a gearbox change, it makes me wonder, did Ricciardo's Renault not need a gearbox change or anything changed? That was a huge crash.
Apparently not.
And he didn't take any penalties. Surprising. That's wow. And he went into that wall sideways, which is often how you damage a gearbox because the drive shafts get pushed through the gearbox.
When Giovinazzi crashed, he went into the wall backwards.
That's right. Yeah, that can do it as well, of course, because the gearbox is on the back of the cars.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting. So quali was sensational. It was really fun to watch. Edge of your seat stuff. Started late, wet the whole time. Every car was out there almost all the time because you had to be circulating, getting laps because it was getting a little drier. So it was great fun. Quali was great fun. Lewis Hamilton, class of his own. Then we talk about, we didn't mention Bottas. He was a bit nowhere. He was P5 or something, was he? 4. Which is not nowhere, obviously, but compared to his teammate, it was nowhere. And then we talk about the race, and it was a dry race, so the weekend was dry after that. Not super hot, was it? And that was different to the previous week, where we'd seen a lot of people not finish the race due to mechanical issues, cars overheating, sensor issues on the Mercedes, a whole bunch of stuff. But we had a much cooler race, and I think that helped the Mercedes in particular. We didn't see any issues with them. It seemed like they were probably sticking off the curbs a little bit more than last weekend.
Yeah.
They did come with some new wiring loom, the Mercedes, to help with their sensors.
In between weekends, I think they've said they identified a fundamental issue, so that's not really something you can fix in
They did try to improve it, and we didn't hear the radio chatter, but the reality was the Mercedes weren't under pressure much of this race. So So the race starts. Everyone gets a pretty decent start.
Hamilton just kind of zooms off.
Yeah, Hamilton does one of those races where the guy on pole, reminiscent of Sebastian Vettel back in the Red Bull days, where they just get a good start and you never see them for the rest of the race. Not to discredit Lewis, he just had a magic weekend. He was on fire. Skip ahead a little bit, Oscar, just because I thought this was fun. When he was interviewed at the end, he said, I love back-to-back races. They're so much fun. I can't wait to go racing again next weekend. So to me, that's ominous. Lewis is loving it. He's motivated.
Yeah.
He's, I think we're going to see Lewis dominate this season. I know Bottas is still winning the championship technically because Lewis came fourth last weekend. But, I think Lewis is going to be on fire this season.
I don't know. This championship is kind of anyone's game, though, as well.
Yeah, well, could be Lando's, but we'll get to that. So, turn one, nothing happening. Turn two is not really a corner. It's kind of a kink halfway down that straight. And then you get to turn three. Tell me about turn three and certain red cars. Oscar, what happens at turn three, lap one?
Well, just a bit of background. I hate turn 3. It's a stupid slow corner, and it's not fun to drive on in the F1 2020 game.
Yeah, for reference, we got the F1 2020 game this weekend. One of the motivations, this is not a paid promo piece, but one of the motivations is they've introduced split screen in it, which Oscar and I love because we can race each other. And we played a lot of Austria this weekend, and turn 3 was not your friend, was it?
No.
But tell me about the Ferraris.
Going back to the actual F1, so Leclerc tries a bit of a stupid dive bomb and gets on the curve, which almost lifts his car up on the side of Vettel's car.
It's kind of 3 wide, isn't it?
Yeah.
Vettel's next to him and ahead. And then there's someone on the outside of Seb as well. I can't remember
somehow Leclerc's car ends up kind of on top of the rear right wheel of...
Yeah, you get that kind of situation
Vettel's
where
car?
wheels touch and one kind of rotates over the other and lifted up Leclerc's car, the back wheel, and smashed it into the rear wing of Vettel.
Which kind of just fell off.
Which basically fell off and destroyed Leclerc's floor in the process. Didn't give him a puncture, as it turns out. So Vettel, of course, basically pulls into the pits. Rear wing, if you're not familiar, front wings in Formula One get damaged quite often. And they basically have one bolt that bolts them onto the front of the car. And they're fragile, they're carbon fiber. The drivers can't really see them either. So they'll often touch the front wing and lose part of their front wing. And it's an aerodynamic surface on the car, like the whole car.
Yeah.
But it's really important, the front wing. And if you get a bit of damage... And this will be relevant later when we talk about Verstappen. You basically pull into the pits, and it takes them about 15 seconds to change a front wing, I think, Oscar.
More like
maybe 20?
8 or 9.
Oh, is it that quick?
Oh,
Okay.
not 8 or 9. Maybe 12-ish seconds.
Yeah, but
it's
anyway,
pretty quick.
so it's long for a pit stop. Like, it's really long, but it's doable and it won't ruin your race necessarily, and is kind of critical because of the aerodynamic performance. The rear wing, however, is not a quick change. It's like a 15-minute change.
Yeah.
And so if you damage it severely in a race, you're pretty much out of the race.
Even
and that's
though
what happened
there was
to Vettel.
a safety car.
Yeah, but he was Dunsky. That happened. You remember Ricciardo Monza a couple of years ago? Someone climbed up on the back, and I think it was maybe Alonso, one of the cars flying through the air, hit Ricciardo's rear wing, and that destroyed his rear wing as well.
That was Spa, but...
You're right. It was Belgium, yeah. Anyway, so Vettel's out. Leclerc circulates a little bit longer, but it wasn't many laps later, right? He DNF'd, and basically they realised he had so much damage, he was terminal. So double retirement for Ferrari.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, last weekend, Vettel's spin. Did Vettel finish the race last weekend?
Yeah.
He did, right?
I think so.
He got a point, didn't he? He was down in P10 or something. I think he was in P10 maybe. But you'll recall Vettel had his spin, and the Ferraris have no pace, and now they take each other out. Charles Leclerc afterwards does what Charles does best, falls on his sword. You got to give the guy that. A lot of racers are always like, oh, it was his fault. Charles is pretty good at saying, yeah, my bad. And it was his bad. He really made a meal of it and destroyed his car and Vettel's car. What about Ferrari this season so far, Oscar? If you're Carlos Sainz, what are you thinking?
Horrible. Carlos Sainz...
P3, he qualified, by the way.
In
Lando
McLaren.
on the podium last weekend. They're
And
both in Q3 this weekend.
Ferrari, despite having a relatively okay Constructors' Championship position, because Leclerc managed to get P2 last weekend,
Yeah. You mean Ferrari
they're
having
slow.
okay constructors?
they're slow.
Yeah,
But
they're super slow.
McLaren is better than Ferrari at the moment.
So anyway, so that was the action at the beginning of the race. Now, what kind of popped off through the rest of the race, as we mentioned, Hamilton's up the road. Verstappen's in P2, Bottas in P3 through most of the race.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. And then everyone else, right? And we'll talk about everyone else.
Because
really
Ricciardo in P5.
Yeah, and the fun of this race was really the midfield battle between the Racing Points McLarens and Daniel Ricciardo's Renault. We should say Ocon broke down, right? And that's why we're not talking about him. He had a great qualifying. Real shame, actually. But again, gremlins for Renault. Ricciardo broke down last weekend.
He didn't really break down either. They suspected an issue and just
He was overheating, right? I mean, you don't pull a car in unless you think it's terminal.
Yeah.
So Ocon retired pretty early in the race, Oscar, from memory?
Relatively early.
And so there's this midfield battle that occurs between the Racing Points. Now, remember I said Perez qualified in 17th or something.
Yeah.
Stroll did a bit better, but not great. He got through to Q2. So the Racing
13th.
Points were on fire in the race. They had so much pace. It was phenomenal. And you'll recall the whole pink Mercedes drama, people talking about them
Renault
being
have now
Racing
launched
Point.
an official protest against.
That's right. And that happened at the end of the weekend, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Renault have basically said, we want to know, we think the Racing Point violates certain regulations. I won't get into it. They quote various regulations. Basically, the big one being you didn't really design your own car because you copied it, is the big issue.
And other teams can't manufacture your parts.
Well, that's fine. I mean, they're not doing that. They're doing their own parts. And you can have other teams manufacture certain parts. And you can have competitors design parts for you as well. So who are the guys that do Haas, Dallara or whoever they are, that do the F2 cars and the F3 cars? So they do the Haas cars, but they don't race in F1, so they can design your parts. But you can't have another competitor design your parts. Anyway, so Racing Point under investigation, that'll be ongoing. But in the race, they were very, very fast. And the McLarens had pretty good pace, and Daniel Ricciardo had good pace on the first stint. But we'll talk about the race winners because that's a fairly simple story. Hamilton zooms off. Verstappen kind of sat in this no man's land between Bottas and Hamilton. Wasn't losing Hamilton much. Sat about 4 or 5 seconds behind him. Bottas not making huge inroads into Verstappen, and Albon distant, right? Albon kind of not helping Verstappen at all.
Like 30 seconds behind.
So that puts Verstappen in a tough position because is he racing Hamilton or is he covering off Bottas? So Mercedes pretty cleverly pit Bottas pretty early. In fact, I think Red Bull pit Verstappen pretty early. And he most of the people, by the way, in the race started on the medium tyre, free choice because it was a wet qualifying, except for Ricciardo, who started... Sorry, other way around. Most started on the soft. Ricciardo started on the medium. And so they pit Verstappen to cover off Bottas, and that works. Then Bottas pits. But then it's hard for Verstappen to catch Hamilton, who can do what he wants. And at some point in the race for Verstappen, he picks up front wing damage. And you could see it, the right-hand side of his front wing. There's these little curly bits that hang off right off the edge, and that was dangling and flapping away. So he didn't have great pace, and that allowed Bottas actually to catch Verstappen throughout the race. And so, unfortunately, Verstappen couldn't hold on to P2 because of that damage effectively, and Bottas eventually catches him and gets past him. And that's your kind of 1, 2, 3. It's Hamilton, Bottas, Verstappen.
Meanwhile, down in 5th place, there's Ricciardo with Racing Points catching him.
Yeah, that's right. And so Ricciardo's doing pretty solid. Remember I said he started on the medium, so he stayed out longer than everyone else.
Yeah.
So he was effectively behind Albon, who was doing nothing in P4.
He was racing Sainz, right? But
That's
then
right.
Sainz had a very bad pit stop. And then, even though Ricciardo was on the mediums, he pitted around when the soft people were pitting.
Yeah, not long afterwards. And I think that was a mistake. It's hard to know how it would have panned out. And I know we focus on Ricciardo as Ricciardo fans, so we noticed this during the race. He started on the mediums, but only ran 2-3 laps longer than the soft runners. The soft runners ran long. They went into about lap 30 in the race, a 70-lap race. That's a long time on the soft tyres. Obviously a bit cooler, not massive degradation this weekend. So Ricciardo pitted, but obviously had no pace. As soon as he came out on the softs, I said to you, Oscar, he's not that fast on the softs. And he commented on that afterwards. He said, we just took a while to get the soft going and then didn't have great pace on the soft.
And then good old Stroll caught up to him. And Stroll was trying to overtake Ricciardo for a good 30 laps, but couldn't.
Well, and before that, actually, Perez came at him. So Perez Perez and Stroll, obviously, we mentioned the racing points, flying through the field. Norris and Sainz at this point, due to pit stop strategy, had fallen back a little bit. But were coming through as well. But the racing points were just hounding through. Perez got Ricciardo pretty quickly and then was on his way after Albon and actually got Albon, right? But in the process of getting Albon right at the end, basically took his front wing off. It was hanging off.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that. Meanwhile, as you say, Stroll is trying to get on Ricciardo and is behind him for, 20, 30 laps and just couldn't get past him. Daniel had worked out how to use his overtake and his battery just to make sure that Stroll couldn't get past him. Yeah. As a result of that fighting, though, along comes a certain Norris, Lando Norris, and he picks up on the back of all of this. So now you got Norris attacking Stroll, Stroll attacking Ricciardo.
And this is all with about 1 lap left.
Yeah, and up ahead a little bit, Perez attacking Albon, and a little bit actually, it was a little bit. It was like 5 seconds, 6 seconds up the road. So a fair bit, given there was only a few laps. And then it all pops off. Effectively, Perez has a go on Albon. And almost loses his front wing and starts to go very slow because, front wing's a pretty important part of a Formula One car. Stroll finally has a go at Ricciardo and gets him into your favourite corner that you don't like. And he has actually, it might have been the following corner down the end of the next straight.
That's a better one.
And he has a go at Ricciardo, but barely, real dive bomb, and doesn't really make the corner. Ricciardo has to get out of the steering, goes off track. Stroll goes off track. Oh, who's there? Lando, who has been flying behind them and sets off. Lando gets past Stroll, and Stroll gets past Ricciardo. So Ricciardo loses 2 places in one corner after defending really well for, as you say, probably 30 laps. So disappointing from that point of view for Ricciardo. Great for Lando, good for Stroll. But they then all set off after Perez in his ailing racing point with its front wing falling off.
So on the last corner of the last lap, they catch Perez.
I think Lando's already caught him, right? Lando got past him just before the last corner.
No, on the last corner, I think Norris gets past Perez. And Stroll and Ricciardo are on the straight. Obviously, they got a better exit than the person without the front wing. More downforce. But they could not catch him. They're about 1/100th of a second away from all of each other.
And the start-finish line's really early in the straight at Austria. If it was 100 metres further down the road, or even maybe 50 metres, Perez would have lost those 2 positions. As it turned out, he kept it. So, but where he was going to beat Albon and come P4, he ends up coming P6, just in front of Stroll and Ricciardo. Stroll beats Ricciardo. Ricciardo ends up P8. Lando, brilliant P5. What a great couple of weekends for Lando, hey? Carlos Sainz, meanwhile, I can't quite recall, Oscar. Carlos, I think, bolted on a set of softs to go for fastest lap. I think he was far enough behind Ricciardo. He wasn't going to catch up, or behind that group, that he wasn't going to catch up. I think strategy had caught him out a little bit. But he was a long way ahead of anyone else. So he bolts on a set of softs. Verstappen bolts on a set of softs, and they all go for fastest lap. But
Sainz gets it, though.
Yeah, Sainz got it. It was pretty fast, too, a 1:05.6, which in race trim's pretty fast.
Yeah.
And Verstappen had that front wing damage, so didn't have a chance, unfortunately. So the racing points, 6th and 7th, honestly could have been, 4th and 5th.
There was some fighting between the AlphaTauris and the Haas during the race too.
Yeah, and you've got to say in race trim, the racing points were the fastest cars after the Mercedes.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, so what happened back down the grid? We didn't see a lot. You mentioned
there was
some fighting. AlphaTauris.
The Haas were all battling each other, actually.
Yeah, Alfa Romeos, AlphaTauris were all fighting.
They were all battling each other.
Yeah, because Raikkonen, Kvyat came P10, right? Which was a decent race for him, so he picks up a point.
They didn't show a whole ton of it on camera. So
No.
I'm not really sure.
No, because that midfield battle was the exciting battle, really.
Yeah.
The Magnussen and Grosjean, 12th and 13th, hey, they finished.
Yeah.
Not too bad for them. Actually, I'm surprised Magnussen beat Grosjean in the end.
They had
Because
a-
I'm sure Grosjean
They had
overtook
a big
Magnussen.
battle,
Right?
the two has.
Yeah. Giovinazzi down at 14. Excuse me. Gasly kind of nowhere down in P15. Russell and Latifi. We should point out, Russell had a good qualifying.
Yeah.
But
P12.
then spun or went off early in the race.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. So first time Russell's gotten through to Q2 ever.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think so.
and P12 on the grid or something like that. So great job by Russell in the wet. Unfortunately, it looked pretty racy too early in the race, but then I can't recall what happened. He went off into the gravel, didn't he?
Yeah.
And then kind of continued. He didn't spin. But I think it was an unforced error, wasn't it? Was he in battle when that happened?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that's unfortunate. He still beat Latifi, but Williams were basically dead last because everyone else was a DNF. The two Ferraris, as we mentioned, and Ocon, who had that mechanical issue as well. So, what's your takeaway, Oscar?
In the Racing Point, they're just so fast.
Yeah.
Like, seriously.
And it'll be interesting to see. So Renault, as Oscar mentioned, submitted this protest against the Racing Points.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting. I can't imagine they're really going to get called out for it. They basically looked at the Mercedes car and copied what they could see. They didn't get designs from Mercedes.
As far as we know.
They do, yeah, as far as we know. They do use a Mercedes wind tunnel, but, that is what it is. They do use a Mercedes engine and gearbox, I think,
Yeah.
and some other parts that they're allowed to use.
Another takeaway, though, is Williams are maybe faster than Haas, AlphaTauri, and Alfa Romeo.
Maybe.
Maybe.
I mean, they
Or at
finished
least
behind
the
them all
same
this
pace.
weekend.
Well,
yeah, they're not miles away, are they?
Latifi was just slow and Russell spun. So I think they could score a few points.
Yeah, my sense of it is that Red Bull, at least with Max in charge, and probably in general are the second fastest car after
Yeah.
Mercedes. The race next weekend is in Hungary, Budapest, and that's going to be exciting because I think that's a track that better suits the Red Bulls. Oddly enough, the Red Bull Ring is not a good track for the Red Bulls. So hopefully that puts them a little closer to the Mercedes, but not too hopeful.
And there actually is a weekend without a race after Hungary.
Oh, no, a weekend without a race. I
And then
love it,
after
these
that,
back-to-back.
we've got 2 Silverstones.
Yeah, so exciting stuff. And I think McLaren and Racing Point are probably pretty close to equal, but Racing Point a bit faster. So Racing Point probably third fastest car right now, certainly in the dry.
I would say.
Yeah, and then McLaren, and then probably Renault.
And they're kind of the midfield, and then there's a lower midfield, which is probably AlphaTauri, Alfa Romeo, Haas, and Williams.
That's right. And so if
but
you're...
there's no clear slowest car. Like
no,
last
which is
year.
good, isn't it? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not like Williams are hanging way off the back anymore. So that's really good for the sport and for the spectacle. It means there's kind of, not much racing at the front if Bottas can't take it to Lewis and Max has got a broken car. But maybe a bit of racing at the front. Certainly that midfield, McLaren, Renault, Racing Point battles are juicy and they're good. And, hey, what a star is Lando Norris so far this season.
Yeah.
Carlos Sainz doing pretty well, probably regretting his choice to move to Ferrari next year at this point. Renault doing okay. Daniel's probably pretty excited to go to a McLaren next year.
Sainz is definitely not excited to go to a Ferrari next year.
No, so yeah. Anyway, so that was kind of the race. Not a nail biter like the previous weekend, but had some good action in there.
Yeah.
And at the beginning and end, kind of where you want it. I'm looking forward to next weekend. I think it was fascinating that we had 2 very different races at the same track. Qualifying helped to mix that up, of course, with a wet quali. So weather played its part. But it just goes to tell you that these variables can make a race good or bad.
Yeah.
And yes, some tracks are probably inherently going to be more exciting all the time.
Yeah.
But we had one cracker race and one slightly boring race.
And
the same
with
track.
Ferrari being demoted to the midfield, there's much more room for people to score points as well. So
That's
it
true.
kind of mixes things up.
Yeah, so where are we sitting in the driver's standings at the moment, Oscar?
So we still got Bottas in the lead.
Right, okay. And is Lewis now second? I believe he is, isn't he? And Lando's
he
a
is.
solid P3. And a solid P3. He's...
And then Leclerc
8
is
points in
kind
front of
of
Leclerc.
not really P4. He is on paper, But
And Checo down in P5 there. What's surprising to me is Verstappen in P6, but I guess he had that DNF last weekend, didn't he?
yeah.
And then only a P3 this weekend. So, and the constructors makes for fun reading.
Gasly and Stroll tied for P9.
Yeah.
Ocon and Ricciardo tied for P10.
Yeah, well, they had the same result, DNF last weekend,
Yeah.
for Ricciardo DNF this weekend.
Oh,
So
P10 technically. They're 11th and 12th, but there are ties ahead of them too.
And
Giovinazzi we've got with 2 points in 13th. Kvyat and Sebastian Vettel with one singular point.
wow.
And Latifi, Russell, or just the Williamses and the Hasses are yet to score a point with Raikkonen.
Phenomenal. Sebastian Vettel, 1 point after 2 rounds, huh? Wow. And, of course, Mercedes are winning the Constructors and McLaren in a really solid P2, kind of 12 points ahead of Red Bull. So that's exciting. Racing Point not too far behind Red Bull, and then Ferrari not too far behind Racing
Like
Point.
I said last week, though, I wouldn't go looking at all of the speeds of the cars and just look at the Constructors' Championship
No,
for that.
with the amount of failures we've had so far with that first race and the dual Ferrari DNF this weekend, it doesn't tell the real story, but it's fun reading. Right, Oscar, I think that's your lot.
Yeah,
Anything to add?
not really.
Right, well, we look forward to seeing you next weekend, reviewing the Hungarian Grand Prix, which should be exciting, new track. As always, reach out to us at Formula One and Son, Formula One and Son at gmail.com, Formula One and Son on Reddit as well. We appreciate your feedback. That's your lot from Formula One
And Son.